Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Melizon, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our second talk of the AI Helps Ukraine conference on behalf of all the organizers. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have Professor Yoshua Bengio with us. And before I introduce our speaker, we would like to briefly tell you a bit more about our charity conference, AI Helps Ukraine.
Thank you, Melizan. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra, and as a member of organizing team, I'd like to tell you a bit more about our charity conference. So our conference is a fundraising event where we bring together the leading AI experts to present recent advances of their research, and in the same time, we're raising funds to support people in Ukraine with humanitarian aid. The schedule of our event is the following. We have a series of online talks during the month of November until early December, and one day in-person event on the 8th of December at Mila in Montreal with keynote speakers, with panel discussion and networking. You're very welcome to attend and register to our event. You can do it at our website. And registration for the in-person event is not open yet, but if you are registered for our online talks, we will send you a reminder when we open it. And the registration is free to all of our events because we believe that knowledge should be accessible to everyone. But in the same time, we kindly ask you to donate to support our mission because unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is still ongoing and people are suffering from the consequences of it, especially in the eastern part of the country. This is the recent picture of one of the buildings from that region. So people there are suffering from the destroyed infrastructure. They really need just basic things, food, clothes, warm shelters. And also they need quite expensive medical equipment. And one of the things which we really want to buy for them from the donations is this tool. This is a device which helps to treat with negative pressure, help to treat wounds, and especially the wounds which people get from the missiles. Unfortunately, it's a very often case right now in Ukraine. And this device is very expensive. It costs about $2,500 Canadian dollars, and we already raised about 1,400. Sorry. And yeah, so please support us. We really would like to buy as many of these devices as possible to help people, because without these devices, the consequences of the injuries can be very negative for people. And your donations really help us to save lives. It's not just a catchy phrase. Unfortunately, that's our reality. But the good news is that we can change it, and together we cannot stop the war, unfortunately, but we can help people to overcome it. So please go to our website, press the donate button, and support us according to your possibilities. And many thanks to our partners, Mila, who kindly supports us with venue and logistics, and to the Ukraine Medical Support, a non-profit organization with whom we together process your donation, buy supplies, and deliver them to Ukraine. And at this point, I want to give the floor to Melizan to introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Before I introduce our speaker, I would first like to quickly mention some house rules. So everyone is welcome to use the Crowdcast chat during the presentation for discussion, comments, sharing papers, and so on. And you may also use the Q&A feature, which is just below, to ask your questions to the speaker for the discussion time after the talk. And you may also upvote the questions of others. We, the organizers, are also deeply committed to making this virtual conference an inclusive, diverse, and safe space for every participant. So we kindly ask you to actively help us in this endeavor. Therefore, according to our code of conduct, hate speech or harmful comments will not be tolerated. Now, without further ado, I would like to shortly introduce our speaker today, Professor Yoshua Bengio. Yoshua is recognized worldwide as one of the leading experts in artificial intelligence and is a full professor at Université de Montréal and the founder and scientific director of Mila Quebec AI Institute. His pioneering work in deep learning earned him the 2018 AM Turing Award, the Nobel Prize of Computing with Geoffrey Hinton and Yann LeCun. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of London and Canada, an Officer of the Order of Canada, a Knight of the Legion of Honor of France, and recently he received the Premio Princesa de Asturias. But beyond earning prestigious awards, prizes, and distinctions, Yoshua is first a researcher whose work aligns with a deep care for the social impacts of AI and the objective that AI benefits all. So today, he will talk about how AI can be used to explore molecular space to fight pandemics and climate change. He's also, he really truly cares about community and his students, and both Alexandra and I can say he's a great and supportive supervisor. So actually, most of the organizers of the conference are students at Mila, and without Yoshua's support, this conference would not have been possible. He was the first to support our idea. So we'd really like to thank his contribution to our charity conference, AI Helps Ukraine. Yoshua, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melisande and Alexandra. Let me share my slides. I have to upload them again, I guess.
Yeah.
We see them well.
Okay, it's working. Sometimes technology works. Right. This is a topic that I got started into actually just around the beginning of the pandemic, trying to think of what I could do with my skill to be helpful. And I started getting interested in the question of how do we design antivirals for COVID. And as I dig more, I learned about, I realized the potential, the highly transformative potential of deep learning in the space of drug discovery. And how this might be actually crucial for us to fight future pandemics and the crisis of antimicrobial resistance, which I'll tell you about. And then I realized that the same techniques that I'm going to briefly mention can also be useful to help to be participate in the big fight against climate change, specifically in the design of new molecules and new materials that can help, for example, on the energy side with better batteries, better methods to store energy from renewable sources, and also to potentially design more efficient and cheaper carbon capture technology. So all things that could really be game changers, but right now would take potentially decades to figure out, and we don't have that luxury. So we need AI to speed things up and allow to explore, for example, the space of molecules much more efficiently. It's a very, very high dimensional space, and the classical techniques of humans kind of guessing may not be sufficiently efficient. Okay, so I kind of said those things already, but let me add an important motivation actually I had for this line of work. Some of the applications, whether it's dealing with antimicrobial resistance or preparing for future pandemics, or materials for helping with climate change, do not get enough attention from industry. The reason is that they don't see enough profit to motivate them to do the required research. So, I mean, there are economic reasons that I wouldn't have time to talk about today, and maybe governments can help provide better incentives. For example, if the price of carbon was increased, that would really make a difference in terms of stimulating the research that's needed. But you know, I think what it means right now, in the meantime, is that researchers have almost a duty to get into these research questions that are important for the planet, but that industry is not investing in. because we have that freedom and we also have that responsibility. Now, as I investigated these questions more, I realized that actually applying machine learning in these areas of molecule discovery, let's say, is not trivial, even from a machine learning perspective, in the sense that it's not just about taking our current state of the art, collecting data sets and just cranking the machine. Unfortunately, they are like really hard questions, but that's also appealing for me and my grad students, because they want to contribute to advances in science. So if we can both advance machine learning and do something for the world, that's extremely motivating, and that's what we've been trying to do. And I'll explain some of the machine learning challenges and the directions we have taken during my presentation. Here. Okay, so now let's start talking about science. A lot of sciences work according to the cycle that you see on the slide, where you have data, modeling, and experiments. So at any moment, let's say we have accumulated some data, we want to analyze it, model it. And the purpose of that modeling is to generate explanatory hypotheses, like theories that help understand the data. And what usually happens is that there are multiple theories that may be compatible with the data. And so the knowledge of these multiple theories can drive the decisions about what should be the next experiment. Machine learning traditionally has been used just for the modeling part, like predicting maybe the outcome of an experiment given the choice of experiment. But today, I will tell you a lot about the other aspect as well, which is how we can use machine learning to do automated experimental design. And one thing I will insist on is on both of these fronts, like the modeling front and the experimental design front. It turns out that similar machine learning ideas can be useful because what they have in common is they allow to sample multiple candidates. So candidate theories, hypotheses to explain the data. And there's a Bayesian flavor to that notion I'll explain, as well as candidate experiments, like what new molecule should we try next in the experiments. And and in both cases, you really want to have not just a single candidate that comes out of like a single prediction, if you want, but you want to have a distribution with a diversity of potential solutions to the questions you're asking. Yeah, so I think this is actually quite exciting, because if we can use machine learning in that experimental cycle, we may be able to do things that current human brains are not good at. Like, I can't read a million numbers coming out of experimental results and make sense of it easily, right? So people use visualizations and all kinds of things like this, but really our brain and our senses are not meant to absorb that kind of data and the quantity of data, not to mention reading all the scientific papers that may be relevant. And then what complicates matters is there are these experiments that we can design, which are also huge. So you could do synthetic biology and generate 100,000 different mini proteins that could each be experimented with. How could a human write down 100,000 different proteins? It's just not human scale. So we need computers, and we need machine learning for that. So the thing that makes this search in the space of hypotheses really complicated, but also interesting, is that the space is huge. For example, the number of drug-like molecules is on the order of 10 to the 60. So even if we had a way to evaluate how useful potentially a candidate molecule could be, we can't just use, say, supervised learning to predict how good that molecule would be after we train it on labeled data coming out of experiments. we can't because the number of candidates is too large. Like I can't run a neural net 10 to the 60 times. So this is a problem. We have a search issue, right? We can't just try everything. And so what we're going to be doing, and the approach that we've been following, and I'm going to detail a bit more, is to train machine learning to generate hypotheses. So we can't try all the hypotheses, all the candidates, but we can train a generative model or a reinforcement learning policy that will sample good things, okay? And obviously, hopefully, like ignore all the bad things and just focus on sampling the set of candidates that may be valuable. So that's a very important idea for my talk. Yeah, and that makes the whole approach depart from a lot of traditional work in, for example, Bayesian optimization, where we use machine learning to help us optimize something, like say the quality of a drug. Here, we're going to focus on a slightly different question. Instead of trying to optimize, we're going to try to sample so that we can explore all the good solutions, or as many as possible. Yeah, so typically, optimization, for example, as you see in the figure, allows us to find one of the maxima of a function or one of the minima, hopefully the global one. But if you think about sampling, you want to sample things that have high values, and so that will allow you to get potentially, if you sample enough things, all of the high valued ones, like all of the maxima that are sufficiently high. Now, let me explain why in the case of experimental design, we want to have a diversity of candidates. Like, why not just do these traditional optimization thing? Is imperfect. It's a proxy for the real thing. For example, in the case of drugs, the real thing is a clinical trial. It's gonna cost tens of millions, if not more, and it's gonna take months and months. So that's too expensive and too slow. So what we do is we have cheaper things, like we could do experiments on mice, or even cheaper, we could do in vitro experiments where, in a test tube, we can actually try thousands of things or hundreds of thousands of things. But of course, these cheaper evaluations of our candidate solutions are not the right thing, are not exact. They miss on some of the properties that we care about. So we can't put full confidence in the evaluation measure that we use to train our system that generates candidates. What we want instead is to generate a diversity of solutions that cover all the different types of solutions, so that if our proxy evaluation wasn't right for some of them, or maybe the majority of them for some reason, hopefully some of the candidates in our batch will still be good on the more accurate evaluation. Right, so this is why we need diversity. Okay. Yeah. This kind of work is also connected to active learning, and the connection here is that it's about how we choose what is valuable according to what criterion. And the old idea in active learning, which was used to decide which examples to label in like images, is to think of the information that we would gain if we were to choose a particular experiment, which is the same as like choosing an image that we want to label. So the label is the outcome of the experiment. And the traditional idea here in active learning was the ambiguous examples, right? The input for which the current model doesn't know the answer. So I'll come back to this. But one problem with the traditional approach in active learning that I've already mentioned is it required to compute that score, like how much information, how much ambiguity there is for a particular candidate, according to our current model, compute that score for every candidate. But if I have 1 million images to label, that's okay. I can run 1 million images in the computer, but not 10 to the 60. So that's why we went for generative models, something that can generate supposedly good things that have a high probability and their distribution that it learns, rather than having to score each one. Then we can score the ones that are generated, and we can generate 1,000 or 1 million, and then score them and keep the best ones. But we do need this first pass of being able to generate a bunch of candidate solutions. So in a way, it's kind of related to how humans imagine experiments, like human scientists imagine experiments, or human chemists come up with new ideas of new molecules to try. Right, so if we put these things together, these notions together, we have this loop I talked about, where on one hand we do experiments, we collect the labels, say Y, for experiments X, and then we have these XY pairs. We could train some supervised learning machinery that's going to give us a score. We're going to actually train it so it doesn't just give us a prediction of what the outcome should be, but rather how much information we might gain on the answer if we did the experiment. I'll come back to that. And then we have a generative model that proposes a batch of candidates, not just one. And in general, in many of these settings, we can actually do many experiments in parallel. It could be 10 if it's all done by hand, or it could be up to 1 million if it's something like antibodies, for example. All right, so let's talk about this information gain story. There's an interesting way to talk about uncertainty or errors made by predictors. The predictor might be uncertain about what the right answer is, which of course is going to give rise to errors, due to two main sources. There is what's called aleatoric uncertainty, and there is epistemic uncertainty. Aleatoric uncertainty is noise. It's the part of the unpredictability of Y given X, which is due to nature. Like maybe there's measurement noise, or you're missing information that is needed to predict Y. And that's irreducible. Like even if I had infinite amount of data, infinite compute, I would still face that uncertainty. And so in a way, it's not interesting. I mean, because we can't control it. The thing we can control is the epistemic uncertainty by collecting data and by collecting the right data. So the epistemic uncertainty is the uncertainty in the answer due to the fact that I have finite data, that I have a finite compute, and I lack knowledge to know what the answer should be. So you can also think of that as the reducible part of the uncertainty. And because it's reducible, we care about it because we want to reduce the uncertainty. We want to know what the outcomes of an experiment would be without having to run it. That would have, that would be a perfect model, of course. All right. So how do we do this? There's very rich literature on estimating epistemic uncertainty, but I'm going to just give you the simplest bare bones method, not necessarily the most efficient or the one that we actually want to use, but it helps to get your head around what is really going on. So a really interesting way to think about epistemic uncertainty is the Bayesian way. And one way to think about what Bayesian means here means that there are multiple theories, like multiple neural nets, that are compatible with the data. In other words, if I train 10 neural nets and they see the same data, but they have different initial conditions, if they disagree on the particular input, well, that's interesting because it says that for this particular input, probably that was not in the data set because otherwise they would agree. They've been trained in a supervised way. It's interesting because if I were to actually collect an experiment corresponding to that input and collect the label for that, they should then all converge to agreement because they're pushed towards the same answer. So in a way, that disagreement tells us that this is not only something new, but it's something that the current model is missing information in order to figure out what the answer should be. So Bayesian machine learning is really about that. It's really about simultaneously entertaining all the possible explanations for the data, and epistemic uncertainty can be derived as a kind of mutual information, or that says, how much information would I gain about which theory is correct by doing an experiment. So the simplest thing is, just train 10 neural nets or 5 or whatever, and then measure the variance of the outputs, and it's a clue towards what epistemic uncertainty is. But there are more sophisticated things you could do. So I kind of already introduced the Bayesian idea. Turns out that there's lots of evidence that humans seem to be able to do that kind of thing, which is surprising because it seems intractable. Like mathematically being Bayesian properly involves these partition functions, these normalizing constant that seem intractable, and even like integrating all the possible neural nets that are compatible with the data, for example, is intractable. So how could we do that? I won't have time to give you the answer, but I can tell you this is something that my group is very much focused on these days. Now, why do we even care? Because most machine learning isn't Bayesian. We just do maximum likelihood or something like this with regularization. The problem from the science discovery perspective is that if you have a single model, it could be confidently wrong. And that could be dangerous from a safety perspective. But also, you lose information about, if you only have a single neural net that fits your data, then you don't know when it's confidently wrong versus when it's confidently right. If you have multiple theories, if you're somehow able to entertain all these theories, you will be able to see that when the first neural net is confidently wrong, there's another neural net that may be providing a different answer. And so since they can't both be right, then we should not trust any of these answers. And that's the epistemic uncertainty I'll be talking about. Another aspect of our work, and this is something I've been thinking about for many years, but only recently really been able to do something that I found satisfying, which is on the modeling side, to not just do supervised learning, but build a causal model where there are random variables that are observed and maybe others that we don't observe, and we would like to understand how they're related to each other in terms of cause and effect. I mean, scientists are trying to do that all the time. And for machine learners, this is also important because a causal model is something somehow more powerful than the standard distributional model, because it's about a family of distributions that share the same parameters but differ because of interventions. Like some of the variables may have been modified, like the state has been modified in some way, and that's very powerful because it means you can generalize to distributions you've never seen. Actually, they share the same parameters. If you get the causal model right. So this might be a key for the major current challenge of machine learning, I think, which is out of distribution generalization. Let me skip this. So going back to the big picture now, I've made it a little bit more sophisticated, and I want to draw your attention that it starts looking a little bit like model-based reinforcement learning, if this is a keyword that means something to you. So we have the experimental bench, I call it the real world here, and we have a model that we're going to train based on the data coming from that experimental bench. But that model is going to be ideally both causal and Bayesian, so it knows about its own uncertainty and it can generalize to experiments that are quite different from those it has seen. And then it has, on the left-hand side, it has the imagination machine, the thing that generates candidate theories, candidate experiments. And those candidate experiments are, of course, then sent to the experimental bench, and we have the cycle I was talking about. Okay, so in terms of technical contribution in the directions that I've been talking about, in the last year and a half, my group has been very busy exploring something quite exciting that may help on both sides, the modeling side and the experimental design side. And we call them generative flow networks, or GFlowNets for short. So the first paper was at NeurIPS last year. What it does is it proposes something that is both a framework for training generative models and a new kind of reinforcement learning approach that has the following property. First of all, it generates compositional objects. So this is convenient in the case of searching in the space of molecules, because molecules can typically be represented by graphs where you may have atoms or residues on the nodes, and as well as other things, potentially like position or angles. So you can use these GFlowNets to generate those graphs sequentially, like one edge at a time, for example. Given the edges that you have already added. So it's nice because of its compositional generation structure. That also means you can represent very rich distributions, unlike some of the related variational methods. So this is also an extension of variational methods. But what's special about it from the point of view of reinforcement learning is that the policy that sequentially makes these choices will be trained towards the objective of sampling, say, graphs, the object that it generates, with probability proportional to a reward function. So normally in RL, we want to sample the trajectories or find the states that give you the largest reward. Here, we don't want to maximize, as I said earlier. We want to sample, and because this is going to give us diversity, because if we sample multiple times, in general, IID samples, they're going to cover all the modes pretty efficiently, right? So that was the first paper. Since then, we have written, I think, like a dozen papers. It's been a very productive year. And I'll talk about a few of them that are relevant to this scientific discovery endeavor. But first, let me try to be a little bit more concrete about what I just said about how it learns a policy. So what is this policy doing? So I'm gonna stick to the example where the policy is generating a graph. So as I said, we're gonna generate the graph one little piece at a time, let's say one edge at a time. It starts with an empty graph. And we're gonna use something like a graph neural net, which is convenient to process a graph. And the graph neural net is going to have some global output. It's going to have outputs at each edge or each node that tell us whether we want to add a new edge, a particular new edge or not. So we're going to do a softmax over these options of which edge to add, keeping in mind the constraints that come from the domain. For example, in chemistry, you have all kinds of chemical rules you have to respect. And of course, you don't want to add an edge that already is present. So it's going to be a constructive process of adding edges. And at each step, we're going to sample from that policy pi here. So the action space here might be add an edge at a particular, between a pair of nodes. And the state is the partially constructed graph. So after we've sampled from that policy a particular new edge, we can transform the previous partially constructed graph into a new graph where we added the new edge in blue here. And then we do it again. And we sample another edge and so on until we sample a special action that says we're done. When we're done, we can collect the reward, which is the estimation by some other neural net, let's say, of how useful we think that candidate molecule would be. For example, how much epistemic uncertainty there is, how useful it is to the thing we care about in general. And the beauty is that we can train this neural net. So for each molecule, we're going to go through the sequence of steps, kind of one per piece that we add. And then we're going to get a reward. We're going to do an update through that sequence of steps by normal loss function. I mean, a different kind of loss function, but it's just something we can put in PyTorch, for example. and do backprop in order to get updates on the parameters, for example, of the graph neural net that defines the policy. Okay, so one of the things that we focused on in our work, starting with the first paper last year, was this idea that by sampling proportionally to the reward, we would be able, through sampling multiple times, to get a high diversity of candidate solutions. And this is what I've been talking from the beginning of this talk, that diversity is important in many ways, but it's important in scientific exploration. And so we measured that. You can think of it like you generate, say, a batch of 100 molecules, and then you cluster them so that the ones that are close to each other will form a cluster, and the clusters are sufficiently separated. You can say these are like, diverse clusters, and now you can count how many clusters you get. And according to these metrics, we tend to find much more diversity than other methods. The other methods are things like standard RL methods like PPO or Monte Carlo Markov chain methods that have been used also for molecule searching in the space of molecules. We've, in an ICML paper that came out last summer, we've extended this to searching in the space of biological sequences. So it turns out, in that paper, actually, we were looking at both searching in the space of peptides that could be used as antimicrobial, basically as antibiotics, and also the space of materials. So these are the two things I started talking about at the beginning. And the difference with the NURBS paper is that we incorporated this notion that the evaluation of each candidate when we train the GFlowNet sampler is based on epistemic uncertainty and not just how good the outcome is supposed to be according to a supervised predictor. Okay, yeah, results. But what they say is, interestingly, in some cases, not only we gain in diversity, but we may also gain in the accuracy. And the reason for this may be simply that the way that we train these GFlowNets compared to, say, standard RL methods lends itself to more exploration. So it might find better modes, regions, configurations that it might not have otherwise explored. So there's something in GFlowNets that encourage exploration. And that could be not only beneficial for the diversity of solutions it can then sample, but also in terms of the top reward. But in general, if you use a method that's really bent on optimization, you might find typically better rewards because you're maximizing rewards than a method that tries to sample. Okay, the last bit I want to mention is regarding the Bayesian aspect I mentioned. So now we are turning, the previous papers were about the experimental design. And if you remember from the beginning of my talk, I was talking about also using machine learning and GFlowNets on the modeling side. So on the modeling side, I said we want to be able to entertain multiple explanations as multiple theories that explain the data. And there is a traditional, classical way of thinking about this, as I said, which is being Bayesian. So let me be a little bit more technical here to explain what we want to do. So let's say that we have a model with parameters theta, and we observe data D. So the thing that the Bayesian approach tells us to do is to sample theta according to the posterior P of theta given D. And we know that's proportional to the prior P of theta times the likelihood P of D given theta. P of D given theta is just the normal likelihood that we would use if we were to do maximum likelihood. All right, so if we just take this prior times likelihood as a reward to train a GFlowNet, then magically, the GFlowNet will sample from the Bayesian posterior. Of course, the GFlowNet is trained, and we have finite capacity for training, finite time for training, so it will not do a perfect job of getting the posterior. In general, the posterior is intractable, and that's why it's been hard to do Bayesian things in the past. But we now have these tools that seem to be quite promising for learning a sampler for a Bayesian posterior. Yeah, and you can do energy-based models using similar math, but that's a detail. Yeah, so that gave rise to this UAI paper that came out last August, and was led by Tristan Deleu, where we looked at the Bayesian posterior over causal graphs. So given some data, we're looking for the directed acyclic graph where the edges indicate a direct cause to direct parent, direct effect relationship. Yeah, it's been tricky to do that kind of thing because the number of these graphs is super exponential. So, enumerating them is, even for small graphs, is out of the question. But we find that these GFlowNets can be tailored to that task quite well, and they perform quite a bit better than existing techniques. Most of the existing techniques, by the way, we're not even trying to get all the graphs because it seems intractable. They were trying to find one graph, which is already hard. But here we know that we can't enumerate all the graphs. So what we have instead is a sort of generative machine that can sample good graphs. And by sampling from it, we can get answers that we need in practice. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more, I wrote a tutorial on GFlowNets, which you should be able to find easily online. And you'll find there as well a bunch of papers that have come out about the techniques for training GFlowNets and different applications. And I'm now happy to answer any questions. Stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yoshua. While we're waiting for questions from audience, I have one question.
Yes.
You mentioned that we need diversity in the scientific experiments because our evaluation is not perfect.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what if the evaluation was like perfect enough? We cannot make it ideal, but if we have a very good oracle, do we still need this diversity, or we can go just with maximizing the reward?
That's a great question. So I think it depends on the setup. There are other reasons why you may want to have diversity. So for example, if you're going to be able to do a batch experiments. So in other words, in practice, many experimental designs, you can run many experiments in parallel. So if you're going to run experiments in parallel, you want to make sure that the different experiments in the batch are all kind of sufficiently different from each other.
I see.
And there are various ways to deal with that. But one way is to have a generator that samples a diverse set of candidates. That's one reason. Another reason why you may want to have diversity is because this is not the last experiment you're going to be doing.
Yeah, that's right.
Like if this is the last experiment in your life, then yes, you want to maximize. Like you want to do the one thing that gives you the most reward or something. But again, like in RL, why do we have exploration in RL? Even though at the end we want to maximize. Because exploration gives you knowledge that can be, used later. So if you're willing to take risks by trying things that are suboptimal, you might learn more. Right. So this is just my intuition. I think it might be useful in the same way that exploration is useful in RL. Like even if the final goal is to maximize.
Makes sense.
But I think these questions have to be experimented with, and like math needs to be done, and this is just my intuition.
Of course, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question from Alexi. Thank you very much for the talk, Yoshua. Maybe I missed this point, but how can these techniques contribute to solving the climate crisis? Right.
So I mentioned at the beginning how this could be used. There are, of course, a lot of ways that people have been thinking of how machine learning could be used to help fight climate change. But here I'm focusing on the design of new molecules and new materials. And the techniques I've talked about are very generic. I mean, they could be applied to any kind of material and or molecule. They are just about the experimental cycle. But we have been, starting to work on specific questions. So there's, for example, the question of how you do electrocatalysis efficiently, so that you can convert the energy that we have temporarily, for example, from a renewable source, into a form that can be stored for a while, like for overnight. And it hinges on finding better materials for doing the chemical reactions that are needed. That's one example. Another example is batteries. So current batteries are very heavy and inefficient, and it takes like a decade to find better materials for batteries. Can we speed that up to find batteries? I mean, it's similar to the electrocatalysis. Again, like it's an exploration in the space of these materials. And both of these cases, experiments are super expensive. You can't do like a million things, or even you might be able to do a dozen things over a period of weeks or months. And so people use simulators, like physics simulators, that take the atoms and run like approximations of quantum molecular dynamics in order to figure out what will happen if we bring these atoms together to form a new material in this context. There's another kind of application we've been looking at, which is in carbon capture. I mean, you could see how carbon capture would be useful. There are already methods for doing carbon capture, but they're like super expensive. And so they, not sufficient to deal with the problem right now. So can we design, so again, it's chemistry, right? So carbon capture is about taking CO2 from the air and converting it into things like water and monoxide, carbon monoxide that can be used in a different way, and just extracting that from the air. So again, the question of design of materials comes up, but actually one of the projects we are working on involves a carbon capture machine, where it's not just the materials you're using, but how do you control the machine so that it's as efficient as possible. And if you want, this machine has many knobs that you can control, and we need to understand what's going on in that machine. So we're using machine learning to help us with that and learn how to control it.
Thank you, Yoshua. The next question is, which research directions related to your talk you have not yet started exploring, but you're excited about, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, I'm always willing to share that kind of thing. Lots. So for example, in my talk, I mentioned efficient Bayesian posteriors for learning complicated causal models of the world. So I've talked about, applying this to modeling a physical or chemical system. One of the things we're interested in is also modeling biology. So if you are like on the medical side of things, we want to understand how cells work and what is the causal graph that relates different genes together. This is called the gene regulatory network. This is a major open problem for biology, because maybe you don't realize it, but biologists don't actually understand how cells work, and the cells are like the building blocks of your body. And of course, they matter a lot. I mean, that dynamics matters a lot when it comes to coming up with cures for diseases. I'm especially interested in infectious diseases, but cracking that would help us deal with things like cancer and many other diseases. I mean, it's the key for future medicine, essentially. So that's a very ambitious goal. But some of the machine learning questions that that involves are things like, okay, so not only we want to find a causal model, but it's a causal model for which we don't observe the causal variables. We have to like figure them out, or we have noisy measurements. So how do we deal with these latent causal variables? This is one of the questions we are interested in. Yeah, there are many questions. Those GFlowNets, we've come up with quite a few improvements to train them, but I think it's still very new, and there's a chance we'll find much better ways of training them in the future. Yeah, I could go on and on.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question, which goes back to your presentation about GFlowNets. So to focus on the analogy between science discovery and this iterative process, a key thing that stands out is scientific theory gives precise predictions and they can be falsified by experiments. Here, yes. Do the signals we get from the generated candidates and subsequent experiments have similar properties? And how could we improve this further?
Right. Well, so remember in my talk, I really hopefully clarified that there are two places where we can use machine learning, and we've been using GFlowNets. One is the experimental design. The experimental design can be a black box because what it outputs is just candidates, and then you're going to try them. The part that we need, like interpretation, like humans would like to be able to understand what is going on, is the causal model, is the thing that entertains the Bayesian, theories that are compatible with data, because we'd like to figure out in human terms what is going on. And I think using a causal framework is quite ideal for that. Because it decomposes the explanation for what is going on in the world into these little pieces that are understandable, like this variable and this variable together cause this variable to change in this way. And of course, these little pieces are things that humans can comprehend, and in fact, that can directly drive experiments. Like you might even not need like a complicated machine learning here. You can have a human look at that causal model and think, oh, there is uncertainty about this causal effect. So let's do an experiment to test this particular causal effect. So that's neat. It also means if we use a causal model that it's going to be fairly easy to incorporate domain knowledge. Like maybe humans, like biologists, know lots of things about. I mean, they don't know how the machine, like the cell, works, but they know a lot. They just don't have the full picture. They don't have the details, but they have a lot of details. And so we could more easily incorporate these with that sort of model. And one of my motivations for exploring this sort of model is also that I think this is closer to how we think. So this is very much inspired by cognitive science and neuroscience of how we think, conscious processing, what's going on in our mind that we can verbalize, how we reason. So by building neural nets that compute in a way that's more like the way humans think, I think the outcome is going to be, you're going to have machine learning systems that can talk a language that's more like what humans can understand. So I think that's very exciting.
Would it be our language or some other language?
Your language, Russian if you want.
Okay, thank you so much for answering this question. We do not have more questions from the audience, and I will use this chance to ask you one more question, if you have time.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so you mentioned about, sorry. Yeah, so you mentioned that this Bayesian approach, and in theory, it works like perfect. We incorporate all the knowledge to the posteriors, and we do not lose any information. But we know that in practice, especially with neural networks, we're always losing it. And I wonder, where is the trick here? Like where we're going to encounter this in your approach?
This is a great question. And there's a related question, which is, why is it that Bayesian approaches haven't really become, common use in machine learning applications in industry, right? So the way that the Bayesian ideas have been implemented, for the most part, involve making very strong assumptions, like about the form of the likelihood, about how the, say, inputs and outputs are related. Like, for example, if you make everything linear, then you can have analytic calculation of the posterior. But that's not reasonable. And then, of course, that limits you to very simple problems not the kind that we want to solve with AI. So then the question is, can neural nets help to deal with this? And I think that we've shown already with some papers that there's, they seem to be able to do that, at least to some extent. So why is it even possible? This is a really interesting question. So first of all, the thing that's interesting here is when you train the GFlowNet using prior times likelihood as the target reward, you're not interacting with the world anymore. You're not like collecting data. This is directly querying this prior times likelihood function. In fact, you can get a stochastic version of it, so you don't need to look at all the examples just one at a time or a mini batch at a time. And so the bottleneck for how complex a posterior you are able to represent is only computation, because it's like AlphaGo. So AlphaGo learns in the computer. It doesn't actually need to play millions of games. If you have a the AlphaGo policy that is big enough a neural net and you train it for long enough, then eventually it's going to learn to play like super well. It's just mathematical. It's just optimization. I mean, you can get stuck in local minima. That's the only problem potentially. But we know that we can train large neural nets, like large language models, like text to image neural nets and so on, that are huge, can learn really complicated distributions, and we can train them. Like we have developed over the last few years these techniques for training them, for designing the architectures, so we can apply the same techniques that have been so successful in AI to build these large, very powerful neural nets to learn Bayesian posteriors. So that's one reason why I'm hopeful that we can solve the problem, at least to some degree. But there's another even more exciting reason. Typical ways of dealing with the Bayesian posteriors seem intractable. Like if you want to have all the modes of the distribution, because you have to kind of explore the whole space to find those modes. And in high dimensions, this is kind of hopeless. But what happens with neural nets, if they have the right architecture, I mean, as usual, is that they can discover statistical regularities in the function they're trying to learn. So you don't need to see all the configurations, you don't need to see all the examples in order to learn a function with neural nets. The neural nets can generalize. Now, there's no guarantee that they will. But if the function you're trying to learn, which is this prior times likelihood, has structure, so what I mean by structure is that you can try some finite number of configurations, like which neural net weights or something like this give rise to which likelihood, and generalize to configurations you have not tried. So now the generalization is not in the space of the usual like input-output pairs. These are fixed while you're training. Generalization is in the space of, say, parameters or like the graphs, in the case of the example I gave with the causal graphs. So the set of graphs is huge. There's no way we can enumerate all of them. But we can train this neural net that will, based on all the graphs that it has tried, generalize to graphs that it has never tried, which is the vast majority of them, because there's like a super exponential number of them. So if we're lucky, and we have been in the past with neural nets, these neural nets can learn these posteriors and generalize, meaning they don't need to see infinite amount of data before they actually get the answer right. So if there is structure, we're good. We have the tools to solve this problem. There's no guarantee. It's like, when you apply machine learning to some problem, you get some data, there's no guarantee that you're going to succeed. Maybe it's like a random function, so there's no machine learning that will ever work. But for many interesting problems, it's not a random function. There is structure, and you can generalize, meaning from a finite number of examples, you can get a good job. You can do a good job on new examples, and that's what these nets do.
Thank you, Yoshua. It inspires me to go and run my experiments right away.
Great.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes for just last
Sure.
question, if you still have time.
Yeah.
Melissa, could you read it? Yeah, let's read this one.
How can we possibly evaluate the causality estimated by machine learning models in a system that human knowledge has uncovered a lot?
Yeah, this is a great question, because actually we have this problem, for example, in biology or chemistry and so on. Well, so first of all, we can do baby problems where we know the answer, just to check that our algorithms do something decent. But then what we can do is use the causal model to make predictions out of distribution, right? So what does that mean? For example, I'm going to give a concrete example. So we have a bacteria that we'd like to kill. That's the antimicrobial problem. And we've tried different interventions, like say some combinations of drugs. And based on the outcomes, we build this causal model, say that, and we measure all kinds of things at each experiment, like the expression of all the genes or something. So now we've got all this data, we've tried all these experiments, which are interventions from the causal sense, and we see what the outcomes are, like what kind of distribution we're getting in each setting of an intervention. Of course, we cannot try all the interventions. There's an exponential number of them in general. But because of the structure of causal models, if we do a good job of capturing the causal model, we will be able to generalize to new interventions. So if we had a good causal model, it should show in out-of-distribution generalization performance. Or we had a paper in 2019 where we show that if you have a good causal model, it will manifest itself by fast adaptation. So the speed at which under a new intervention, you're able to adapt to the new data and predict, things under that new distribution will be greater. It will learn faster if you have the correct causal model. So we show that the correct causal model learns faster than the incorrect causal model. So yeah, you have empirical way of checking whether your model is good, but of course it doesn't guarantee that you got a good model. But in any case, because of the Bayesian way of thinking, there is not one, you don't know what is the correct causal model. You only have a set of models, and maybe that set is not even enumerable, but you can sample it.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? The last one?
Sure. Yeah.
Great. So Yoshua, thanks again for the talk. What is the connection between GFlowNets and modularity and compositionality?
I missed one of the words after, and modularity. Okay, I got it. Thanks. I see the text. Right. This is a great question that touches on another aspect of my research, which has to do with how we could build AI systems that reason like us. And what is reasoning, at least the way humans reason, is connected to compositionality, because reasoning is about bringing together selected pieces of knowledge in a coherent way in order to draw conclusions, make predictions, plan, do counterfactuals, all kinds of neat things. So, what's the connection to GFlowNets? Well, remember GFlowNets sample compositional objects. In other words, objects that are described by a composition of choices. For example, a set or a graph. For example, it could be a plan. It could be a proof of a theorem. Could be the semantic parse of a sentence. Right. So all of these kinds of objects are compositional, meaning that they're constructed through a sequence of steps that combine the right selected pieces of knowledge in a way that's coherent. And so that's already something nice, but there's better than that. I've talked about the reward function for training GFlowNets as if it was a black box, but we can do better than that. We can peer into that black box and design it so that it has nice compositional properties. So a reward function, you can also think of e to the minus energy, if you think in terms of probabilistic models and energy-based models. And because the reward is like unnormalized probability. Now, that energy, there's a classical way in probabilistic modeling to get compositional structure in energy-based models, which is to say the energy is a sum of simpler energies that relate just a few variables together. For example, in physics, so think about like gravity or Coulomb forces. You've got atoms, and they are, the ones that are close to each other, they have some force. The force is just derivative of energy. So there's like a little energy term that tells how these two will interact. And that's one energy term. And there's another energy term for how these two will interact, and so on, right? So the total energy is written as a sum of simpler terms that each involve few variables. And in physics, typically there's two variables, right? The Coulomb and gravity is just two things at a time. So a lot of things, I think the way that we understand the world also has this property that knowledge is composed of these simpler pieces that we can put in a sentence, right? So think about Wikipedia. It's a bunch of sentences. Each of them is like a little bit of information, which relates a few variables together. So the way that we think also has this knowledge representation as a set of small pieces of knowledge that are just, what we need in order to do this kind of powerful reasoning that your question is about. So I hope that I have given you a kind of glimpse as to how GFlowNets might be connected to the problem of reasoning. Modularity and compositionality being, two aspects of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yoshua. I think we can wrap up at this point. Yeah, thank you one more time for your talk and for your support of our mission. And thanks to everyone who attended this talk. Please donate to us. As we mentioned in the beginning, it's very important. And yeah, thank you everyone for this very insightful discussion.
Yeah.
And thank you for organizing this. And I thank in advance the audience for their generosity. Thank you in advance.
Yeah. Thank you. And don't forget to go to our website, sign up to get the updates. Our online talk series is continuing until the in-person event on the 8th of December.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.